Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from OSCON in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. Learn more at openshift.com. I'm Alex Williams of the New Stack. I'm here at OSCON with some people who I'm happy to be here with, respect very much. Guys, how are you? Kelsey Hightower. Kelsey, this is your show. This is OSCON. You're the chair here this year.
Chair, so instead of giving talks and tutorials, I'll be helping make sure the entire conference runs smoothly and we get to see nice people like Adrian and Jamie.
And Adrian Cockcroft is here. And Adrian, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
It's good to be here. If he's the chair, what can I be? Can we be the tables or something?
Yeah, something like that. And Jamie Dobson, who is now regular to the North American circuit from his home in London.
That's right. Hey Alex, how are you? Good to be here. Second time we've met in the States in the last 2 weeks.
That's right. Yeah, I saw you in Vegas. So what were you saying about infrastructure startups, Kelsey?
Well, so there's a lot of talk of what role do infrastructure startups play in this crowd, the migration to the cloud, right? So I think a lot of the value can be captured in on-prem, where a lot of the automation tools aren't there. A lot of the pain points are there worthy to be paid for. But in the cloud, you see a lot of overlap, right? So, how do they survive in that world of infrastructure where most people think of the compute as what you pay for, the compute, the CPU, the memory, but do you pay for the software that allows you to do that? And in the cloud trends, that answer is normally no, right? You expect the APIs to manage that stuff. It's just part of the cloud platform. Whereas in the infrastructure space, people selling the tools, that is the value prop, the APIs to manage your compute. And those things are decoupled on-prem, but in the cloud, they're usually sold together as a complete package.
So what does that mean then for the startups?
I think that's the topic of discussion here, right? I mean, if you look at it, for people looking to stay on-prem, you really need these startups to take that innovation that happens in the cloud, package it up in something that's manageable, put a price tag on it, and you rerun it in your infrastructure, right? And you try to keep up with the trends that are going forward. But if people are actually moving to the cloud and shutting down data centers, does that still work, right? Do you need a company focused on giving you the APIs to manage your compute instances when you already have them?
Do you, Adrian?
Yeah, this is very close to my opinion too. I think in the short term, it's actually there's some more interesting products. There's a lot of there's sort of this Cambrian explosion, as I said before once, of container schedulers. Every time, there's yet another one this week. I think I found a new one, right? Whatever. So there's just too many of them, and eventually it'll sort of calm down, and there will be one or two that basically they'll all adopt each other's features until they all look more similar and be the same. But the real battle is over what happens in the data center, as Kelsey said, because I think in the long run the public clouds vendors will just be a feature of how you run stuff. It's like EC2 knows how to run VMs, ECS knows how to run containers. At the moment maybe it doesn't have all the features you want, so you'd use something else on top of AWS instead of their built-in thing, but in the long run they'll just figure out how to capture most of that market, and then that applies to Azure and Google as well.
So they'll just keep capturing the market.
It's just a feature. It's just you want your container runner to be integrated into the thing you're running it on, and it should come for free with those products, really, right? So it just becomes it commoditizes into the public cloud. That's what I'm saying. But it'll be a while before that happens, and in the data centers there's quite a lot to play for in the meantime.
You run across infrastructure startups all the time.
Yeah, I do.
And?
I think there'll be a great consolidation. I think if you look at other tech waves, when I was in Vegas when we last met, I was there talking about tech cycles and how they start, and they usually start with discovery of a part of nature that we've yet seen, surrounded by an explosion, and as Adrian said, Cambrian explosion of tooling and companies around, and then begins a slow consolidation, usually into a handful of market leaders. That's the destiny of all new ideas.
Wow.
So that's what's going to happen.
So where are we now, you guys? Kelsey, where do you think we are right now? Like, how would you judge it right now compared to 6 months ago or a year ago?
Well, I definitely see people speeding up in that direction of saying, if you look at it, the cloud providers are now actually jumping ahead in the ones producing these tools, right? You can say in some cases
Right.
it was the startups producing these new things, like in the
Right.
case of Docker. But now you start to reverse the script, and the cloud providers are open sourcing some of this technology.
Right.
And then there's a land grab to either support them or add features on top. I think the key is, what features do you add on top? Do you compete with them directly, right? Maybe in the case of Kubernetes versus something like Nomad from HashiCorp, or do you have custom schedulers that make the cloud operate a little bit more efficiently? So I can see a world where maybe not the full cluster manager, maybe you don't compete there, but things like Kubernetes do support multiple schedulers. So maybe you have maybe a better scheduling algorithm or way of rebalancing that your cloud provider doesn't. And I can see that being some value. So that would be more of a drop-in infrastructure tool that enhances the platform that you're on.
So a custom scheduler, for example.
Yeah, you see this all the time. So for instance, even in something like Kubernetes, there's 3 schedulers already. Most people don't know that. So there's a generic one, there's one for daemon sets, there's one for jobs. And if you look at what people are asking for, they want a scheduler that integrates with their business model, meaning you can only run on these machines in this zone if you have this priority level. And maybe some of those things are too specific for it to be found in a general product. Who's going to fill that space, right? And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity will lie. Can you drop one of those into one of these existing platforms, and that way you're not necessarily playing in that territory that's going to be hard to win.
Is that because schedulers are one of those very semantic kind of, tools that you need? I mean, there's all different kinds of schedulers needed for different kinds of.
Think about how you
workloads.
schedule your life, right? Like every human being has different inputs that affects their priority on time, right? If you have children, you may need to leave at a specific time. That is one of your predicates that you make a decision on. So I think companies are the same way. Some people make decisions on greenhouse emissions. I can't run in that data center because it's over my footprint. Some people would say the cost, like this server has a very expensive GPU in it, and I actually need to avoid using that unless it's for one of these workloads. So given that set of inputs that most people need, you end up getting some of these customized rules.
So what I envisage happening is that the way there'll be, our workflows will change. The tools will change the way our workflows work, and there'll be sort of cycle, feed into each other. So if you look at cities now, cities are changing to accommodate IoT devices. So infrastructure is always reflected in workflow and vice versa. So what I reckon is there'll be the tooling will start to sort of, how do you call it, what's the word? Converge, right? There'll be a convergence around some of the features of the tooling, and there'll be a convergence of workflow. But I still think that right now we just don't know. There's a lot of speculation, and nobody really knows what's going to happen.
I think converge, but in a very narrow area. So if you look at the underlying platforms that we see for these cluster managers, they won't necessarily have to change drastically. The small piece, the thing that makes the decision on where it runs, but what happens after that, that's just part of the pipeline. Where you hook in to make that decision, that is like an open playing field that can run and be adapted to any platform. If you look at them, like Mesos is already doing this today. Look at all the things that are built on top of Mesos. You have Spark, you have Hadoop, you have all the frameworks because it kind of reflects what people want to do on top of them. So to me, there's some value prop in that, where you decouple yourself from the infrastructure and those things, but then you bring the workflows that I just don't think anyone's going to nail one workflow for everyone.
There's a couple of things happening here. Right now, in the last 6 months, a lot of these frameworks have gone to sort of a 1.0 status, right? They're sort of saying, yeah, we're sort of production ready, or you can run them, and people are working on scale and production type things rather than basic functionality. So you've seen that with Kubernetes and Nomad and Rancher, and whereas Mesos has been out in a more production capable sort of state for a bit longer, but then they've got more frameworks that they're working on. So it's becoming real this year that you can use these things, and I think over the next year you'll see the feature sets start to converge and a bit more of a shakeout happening.
So what kind of feature sets would you see converging?
We've already seen, like, the pod concept, I think, has now turned up in Marathon. Is that right?
Yeah, so for people that are not aware of the pod concept, but this is this idea that, you're building all these things in the microservices approach where one container does a specific thing, but in reality, for a lot of people, you usually need multiple containers to actually make up a logical service. So the idea that...
to schedule them as a unit. This doesn't, you want to put them all on the same thing, but there's a multiple containers. So as a unit of scheduling, it makes sense to have a clump of things, or a pod of things. So that's a useful concept. It's a pretty opinionated. If you weren't.
Why did that happen now? I mean, that's what I'm curious about. Why are we seeing this kind of consolidation first?
It's not a consolidation. It's basically this is what happens everywhere. If you look at this, databases, everyone basically converges
Just
on the same
converge,
feature
exactly.
set. It's like everyone's just stealing the best ideas from everyone else, and they're saying, if somebody says, "Oh, we have this thing and you don't," so they win a deal. Well, we'll copy that thing, and then we get to not lose against them on that one point, right? So in a competitive environment where everyone's pitching to the same big companies saying, hey, we want this thing, people are sort of converging on the feature set that matters, right?
Yeah.
So it's the product market fit is starting to emerge in this space, I guess, is one way of looking at it.
Yeah, and in our case at ContainerSolutions, you see a lot more inbound requests. So 1 year ago, it was the research department asking us about containerization, orchestration, the cutting edge of the large enterprises. Now we're getting more requests from, dare I say it, more normal people, right? People who've got real problems to solve, they've heard about containers. So we're seeing the inbound traffic coming in, it's jumped maybe by a factor of 10 or 15. And I suppose one of the nicest things of being a technological agnostic.
So what are the unknown areas, that well, I guess maybe putting it a different way, who do you kind of sense will be some of the survivors in the infrastructure startup space? What are some of those, maybe broader look at some of the categories where there's still a lot of uncertainty?
There's a weird thing going on where everyone you talk to puts themselves as the center of the world and stacks everyone else above or below them. So if you talk to Mesos, they can say, you can just run Kubernetes as a scheduler on it, but then you talk to Kubernetes, well, you don't need Mesos because it does that underneath, but you could probably run Mesos on top of Kubernetes, and then you can run that on OpenStack, then you can run OpenStack on top of that, and then you can just go around this sort of, you can build your stack as deep as you want until you've used up all your memory running frameworks, and then there's nothing left to run your actual program. But having everyone come to some agreement as to what order these things actually do stack in would be a interesting sort of outcome at this point, because everyone's disagreeing right now on who's in charge and who's plugged into what.
Yeah, so the truth is that nobody will survive currently. Nobody will survive in their current state. There's going to be continued evolution. Some companies will rise, some will fall, some will merge, but all the tools, for example, Google is unlikely to go anywhere, but that doesn't mean Kubernetes today will look like Kubernetes in 1 year from now. And so in a way, we're all involved in this sort of huge design process for sort of figuring out these next steps. And actually, it's totally wasteful. If you have 10 companies copying each other, it's totally wasteful. There's actually a lot of evidence, just small aside now into my talk for Thursday. There's tons of evidence that show monopolies can be more innovative than competitive systems, or where there's multiple companies, because they all waste their energy solving the same problem. And there's a lot of that right now, and I don't suppose there's a solution to that.
So I think when I measure, for your question, who will survive, the one thing I always ask is, if I took away the node, this concept of a machine, if I took it away, do you still add value? If the answer is no, then I don't think you survive, because I think long term we're all moving into this world where I think most developers, or even people in ops, don't really want a machine with a raw OS that you have to patch and build it up into a useful state, right? That's just starting too below the finish line. So I think when I think about who will win, if you think about Kubernetes and the evolutionary path for Kubernetes, there should be no nodes underneath that you think about. You should say, here's an API for running applications, right? Maybe you want a little bit more control. I know Adrian talks about this a lot, of moving towards the cloud functions Lambda model, where you just describe the functionality and what inputs it handles. And again, that's where the node is gone, and we start to move forward just for purely the application.
So the cloud functions, a Lambda model, this is something that, harkens to this, we were talking a little bit before, right? This serverless.
So you got to change the name.
You got to change the new stack. We're going to have to be the no stack, right?
The no stack, because there's no stack
there. Yeah, and containers, I think, fit in that world, because containers don't have to be coupled to a machine, right? And when I look at a cloud function, it's very much, hey, the provider is going to do everything else for you, right? It's going to handle the logging, the way things come in and things come out. But I think even a container could be thought of that way. It's a complete package of the entire app, but when you push it, everything will be handled for you at that point, right? Like the FedEx model. You ship your box, and it'll make it go wherever you need to go. So I think that is still going to be a thing.
But there's a lot of services along the way that are needed to integrate with that environment, right?
But we've been doing that for years, like DNS, for example, right? You have an app, no matter where you deploy it, even on a virtual machine, you just have this lookup service that you just trust will do the right thing, right? So that's one service that I think most people consider stable at this point. And every cloud provider has another set of services, whether it's a hosted database or something to make your life easier. That's just part of the platform at this point, right? So I kind of look at it like the application containers 10 years ago. You go get JBoss or WebLogic, you put your app in there, and they do a bunch of things for you. I think we're taking a step back and saying the whole cloud platform is your application container. You just specify your payload, you drop it in there, and the services around it come for
So that
free.
would mean then there's going to be all kinds of different workloads then, right? And
Oh,
so
exactly.
now you're going to need kind of there's going to be a requirement to manage those different types of workloads within these environments.
Well, I think one of the interesting things here is that containers have come up over the last couple of years, and people are getting used to them, and it's getting mature. And then the whole serverless concept's a different workload, and it came along, and most of the container systems weren't built with that in mind. You can sort of stick it on the side, but if it takes you, say, half a second to schedule a container because there are a bunch of stuff has to coordinate, that's fine if the container's going to live for 10 minutes or a week. If it's going to live for 0.1 seconds and it takes half a second to schedule, it's just not going to work, right? So the overhead of scheduling a container extremely quickly. And the AWS spent a lot of time tuning Lambda, which is the most mature one right now, and I'm hearing people say it's like 10, 20 milliseconds from a standing start to schedule a container. And Google App Engine is similar, right? You can schedule a job there that hasn't run for ever before, and it'll come up really quickly. So those technologies are built into some of the public cloud infrastructures, and when you take the open source thing that somebody built for one use case and you try to do this on it, then maybe it doesn't run that efficiently. So there's quite a lot of work to be done still to support the serverless use case.
What is the work that needs to be done?
It's basically just tuning everything for the overhead of starting a job. Right? It's because effectively what you're really doing on a machine when you start a container is you're starting a process with a few extra system calls around it. But when you're scheduling a job, you're picking which machine, and you're talking to your service registry, and there's a bunch of protocol and machines agreeing on things and decisions that have to be made, and that decision can't take longer than the thing you're trying to decide to do. Right? It's like spending all day deciding which fast food joint to go to for 5 minutes.
And I think
it doesn't make sense.
I think what makes the process worse is trying to do that where you don't control everything. So if you're trying to do this in any customer's environment, they all want to do something different. Different stores back in, different compute models, different processes for release. And trying to integrate all of that just means more inefficiency. On the cloud provider, they can set all the rules, what happens underneath. Given that, they can focus, right, and spend all their time tuning instead of building support for 50 different storage vendors. And I think this is where it's really hard to compete when someone has laser focus on a single thing. Trying to bring that to everyone is really it's almost impossible to do efficiently. You got to make some choices.
So we've seen the containers be popular with developers. Now we're starting to see the containers being used more in operations, right? So so the containers basically kind of fit in both these worlds, right? Now we're starting to see containers, pop up in discussions about networking and in storage as well. Jamie, you've been working kind of in this area a little bit to some extent with your mini Mesos and like in that environment. Is that one of these areas that we still don't know, who those providers will be? Because it seems like there's so many unanswered questions that that we have about how these networks behave, how these storage environments behave. Or is this just another example of a feature set that's just going to be part of the cloud services?
I think there's a few missing pieces. I think you go in order, don't you? You start with the most basic things, the container unit itself, and then we move to scheduling, which is basically automated ops, and then there's some unanswered questions around networking, storage. We're not quite sure how we're going to resolve them, and then of course monitoring, which is an interesting one because we tend to monitor microservices as we used to monitor distributed monoliths, but it doesn't work. So we've got high frequency sampling, and that produces so many messages that the logging or the monitoring software around that will be more complex than the application, your app actually monitoring. Now that's similar to the point Adrian just made about, spending the whole day looking for a burger joint just to eat your food for 5 minutes. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I think it's this transition from the world of distributed monoliths, the Gmails and the Facebooks, to the world we're entering into now. And some of the paradigms, the paradigm has changed in our minds. We sort of understand certain parts of the new world, but we've taken bits of the old world with us, and we're yet to jettison them. And we haven't jettisoned monitoring out the old way of doing it because we don't know how to do it in the new way. And I think those are the interesting battlegrounds for me in the next 12 to 18 months, at least intellectually.
Are those your guys' battlegrounds, or are they others?
Yeah. Monitoring is a big problem right now. There are very few tools out there that can deal with the serverless state. So if you build your application of a mixture of sort of VMs and containers and Lambda functions, cloud functions, you've got, you can monitor bits of it, and then there'll be big empty spaces where some magic happened here that you can't see, and there's no way to track what happened and how it's behaving and what's going on there. So there are some built-in tools for doing it, but they're not integrated into the standard products that people normally use for monitoring yet. So it'll come, but I think by the end of this year you'll have support for them, but it's still pretty early days.
What goes wrong? Well, what are some of the things that go wrong if you don't have those monitoring environments in these serverless architectures?
Well, the way that the serverless functions are hooked together, it's a call, there's a sort of path that everything's calling everything else. It's an event-driven path. You have to figure out which path your thing went down. If it does something that you weren't expecting, why, right? You've got to effectively be able to get in and debug what's going on. You want to be able to see why it suddenly took longer, or maybe something broke in the guts of the system because of security changed. There's a bunch of things that can go wrong trying to deploy it. Getting the security right around it, because these are whitelisted functions, they typically are given permission to talk to certain things, right. And one of the common bugs is it doesn't work in this environment because you thought you'd set it up right, but you hadn't quite got the permissions right, and it can't quite read from that database or whatever API it's trying to talk to.
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things around security, is that when we move to this architecture of microservices, different teams producing different services, who's in control of the security around them? Who's in control of governance? And I think that's more of a management and a leadership thing than it is a technical thing. And I think that's the other thing that needs to catch up. How do we manage teams that produce architectures for this new set of tools we're building?
I guess then my last question really is about then the existing players out in the market now, right? So we're talking about who's going to survive among the infrastructure startups. The question then I inversely wonder about, well, what does that mean for the existing, players who've served who've been, serving the data center for generations?
I think we need them because Docker doesn't happen without them. A lot of things don't happen without them, right? How do we make that sustainable is kind of my big question. I think you need these independent thinkers that are not, locked into one provider, coming up with these ideas and expect them all to make them general purpose to work across all the other competitors in your space. So we need them. They definitely offer a lot of value, but is it sustainable to approach it from a startup where you're expecting these large returns on investment versus a group that's really focused on, delivering some value that everyone can use? Like this is the contention point. We definitely need them. So it's not like they're unnecessary. It's just that is it sustainable? Is it a contention point?
Yeah, it's the situation now is that if you're in the infrastructure software space, it's just the open source conference. You have to be open source. It's very hard to sell software now that isn't open source, and getting the business model right around that is actually pretty hard, and there are a lot of people giving stuff away for free and saying we'll figure out how to make money out of it later, but it's a hard problem. It's an area that, since I work for a VC firm, it's one of the things we worry about. If you aren't open source, then you won't get traction. If you are open source, you have to figure out how to make money on it. We've actually we're having an open source summit in Palo Alto on the 2nd of June. Battery Ventures is running. To just go into specifically this problem. We've got Martin Mikos and Max Shirison and a few other people giving talks there.
Great. Anything else, Jamie?
No, I think people there's a fantasy that we can leave the old world behind and just, I think that's the latest plot to the new X-Men movie, right? We leave the new world behind, old world behind, and the new world will just, be born fully formed. History of technology, last 200 years teaches us stepwise improvements is how it happens, so that the worlds will continue to coexist.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that next episode of X-Men. So, thank you guys very much for taking some time. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank
Great
you.
conference,
Thank you,
Kelsey. Congratulations on it.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from OSCON in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. Learn more at openshift.com.